So I've been thinking about something in regards to disasters, be they natural or man-made. Which am I most worried about? Am I worried about a disaster taking place and people are, for the most part, harmonizing with each other and cooperating? Or am I worried about a disaster taking place and people are not cooperating with each other? Well, obviously, I'm more worried about the latter. When it comes to disasters, be they natural or man-made, everyone likes to talk about food. If you have been listening to right-wing radio for the last 2 decades or so, you'll know that on the commercials, they love to talk about food and food disasters and why you should buy MREs. I remember when I would listen to Michael Savage on the radio. On the commercials, they were either advertising some kind of gold, like invest in gold, buy gold, or they would try to sell you MREs, made ready-to-eat meals. And MREs they're meals that are designed for the military, and they're very expensive. But the right-wing commercials, they love to sell these things to people because when it comes to concerns about food crises and disasters, it's usually conservatives or people who lean right who are mainly talking about that. But people are talking a lot about food, and they should. I mean, it is an important thing, obviously. But when it comes to disasters, when people cooperate, they can survive. When people work together, they will find ways to survive. So, for example, I recently watched a video on what people ate during the Dust Bowl. And the Dust Bowl was this very catastrophic, cataclysmic event that took place in American history, in which a giant storm of dust ripped through a large chunk of the United States, including the Texas Panhandle, and destroyed farms and destroyed a lot of agriculture. So a lot of farms were destroyed, which meant that there was a food crisis wherever the Dust Bowl destroyed crops and farms and agriculture. And regardless of this, people found ways to survive. People found ways to get food because they would do what it took. People would form foraging teams, and they would go out and they would find wild plants. They would find the young shoots of tumbleweeds, and they would brine them in jars and preserve them. People would get whatever fruit that they could get, berries and other fruits, and they would preserve them. People learned how to can. People learned how to jar their own food. People shot jackrabbits. Popcorn was pretty cheap, and people would just boil milk and put popcorn in the milk, and they would have popcorn soup. It wasn't the best thing to eat, but it filled your stomach up. People would take spaghetti and carrots and whatever they could find and make a casserole. People found ways to survive. When people work together, they find ways to survive. So when it comes to a disaster, food does not necessarily have to be the biggest concern, the biggest worry when people work together. The problem is not really a disaster and people are cooperating. That's obviously not the biggest problem, because if people cooperate, then people can survive. The problem is when you have a disaster and people are not cooperating, people are not in harmony, people are planning on killing their neighbors, people are planning on robbing their neighbors and pillaging their neighborhoods, people are planning on screwing their neighbor over. That's where the real serious problems begin. And, a lot of that was taking place during the Second World War, especially in Eastern Europe. I'm about to finish this book. It's called Poland's Holocaust by Tadeusz Petrovsky. I have about 17 pages left of this book, and I've been reading it on and off pretty slowly, but there's so much detail in this book about the horrors that were taking place in Eastern Europe, especially in Ukraine and Poland. And there was a disaster, and that disaster was the German and Soviet invasion. That was the disaster. And there were people who took advantage of this disaster to kill their neighbors. In this case, it was Ukrainian nationalists who wanted to murder their Polish neighbors. They took advantage of a disaster. And instead of working with their neighbors to deal with the disaster, they decided to kill their neighbors. It was so horrific. In just 1 month, in one area of Poland called Wolin, 20,000 Polish people were butchered in just 1 month. I believe this was in July of 1942. I know that it wasn't in July. I know that it took place in a July. I'm pretty sure it took place in July of 1942. And a lot of that killing took place in just 2 days of that month. 20,000 people. And that was just within the first year that these killings were taking place. The reign of terror done by the Ukrainian nationalists on their Polish neighbors, it went on, I believe, from 1941 all the way up to, I want to say, 1947 or 1948. It continued on even after the Second World War. And that was an example of people taking advantage of a disaster to kill their neighbors, as opposed to working with their neighbors. Now, even if you can say, well, it's not a natural disaster; it's a man-made disaster, right? In this case, it's an invasion. Regardless of that, even if you get invaded, if people are cooperating, if neighbors are cooperating, if villages and towns and cities are cooperating, and they're forming food foraging teams, they're forming neighborhood watches, they're forming partisan groups. If people are cooperating, you're going to have a lot less misery, as opposed to if people are in complete disarray or people are not in harmony with each other. If people in Poland and Ukraine really cooperated with one another, then there would have been a lot less deaths. And what's interesting is that Ukrainian nationalism wasn't even that popular in Ukraine. It really wasn't. It really only got power through Germany. Once the Germans invaded Poland and Ukraine, the Ukrainian nationalists saw their opportunity to kill their Polish neighbors. So instead of harmonizing with their neighbor, they decided to kill their neighbor. So really, my biggest fear is not really just food. Food is definitely a concern, but it can be dealt with if people work together. My biggest fear is people. Anyway, you guys just heard some theology. God bless.